And we are back with the third segment of the GSMC Basketball Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. And in this third segment, we are going to be looking at the matchups that are going to be happening tonight for the play-in tournament. And these are the Eastern Conference matchups. I haven't talked about them yet, and they actually start at 7 o'clock. So forgive me for saying that they start at 7:30. They actually start a lot earlier than that. And the first matchup, we're just going to go right ahead and dive right into these matchups. So the first matchup is going to be the Heat against the Sixers. And this is going to be a really, really interesting game because it's all going to be dependent on whether or not Joel Embiid can play well against Bam Adebayo and how well the Sixers are going to be able to handle that pressure. So I think that between the two teams, I think the Miami Heat have the better chance of winning against the 76ers simply because of matchups, I guess you could say. I think Bam Adebayo, while he is much shorter than Joel Embiid, should be able to put up a relatively good fight against him in this play-in tournament. And usually, when the playoffs roll around, the refs are a little bit more lackluster when sending people to the line. You wouldn't be able to tell that if you watched the Lakers game and you watched the free throw difference between the Lakers and the Kings. Not the Kings, the Pelicans, excuse me. But going into this matchup, and usually going into the playoffs, I genuinely, my faith in Embiid is very, very low. I genuinely do not think that Joel Embiid is going to be able to beat the Miami Heat because the Heat have been able to overcome ridiculous amounts of pressure to ultimately grant themselves a deep playoff run. And even though they're a relatively low seed, they always seem to turn it on in the playoffs as a team. Not just Jimmy Butler, as a team. They always seem to turn it up when they really need it. And I don't really think, assuming Jimmy Butler goes off, I don't really think the Sixers have a matchup good enough to stop him from being able to go off. And the fact that this isn't really the first time that the Miami Heat have been in this situation, I think they're going to be able to handle the pressure a little bit more because this is essentially an elimination game. So I really feel like they're able to handle the pressure a little bit more than the Sixers would be able to handle this kind of pressure. Now, this is going to be the first time that Tyrese Maxey is sort of expected to have very good and dominant production in the postseason. Before, previously, it was all on James Harden and Joel Embiid to have that kind of production. And now it's Tyrese Maxey's turn, along with Joel Embiid's turn, yet again, to sort of perform. And given how this is really the first time that he's averaged 25 points, and this will be the first time that he's going to be the second option in a playoff game, we're going to have to look and see how well he plays and how he handles the pressure. Because quite frankly, I'm not entirely sure if Maxey will be able to handle the pressure playing in the postseason. Now, for Joel Embiid, I'm really not that confident with Joel Embiid. He hasn't made it out of the second round at all in his entire career, and almost every single time he gets injured in the postseason, and he also ends up not playing well in the postseason or not playing good enough for the team to win. Similar to how in the last year's matchup when they matched up against the Celtics, he played really, really bad in the elimination game, along with James Harden, simply because in that entire game, he was just flopping and ref baiting and trying to get the ref to send him to the line. And you can't do that in the postseason. You have to look to score. And the fact that he just doesn't look to score and just looks to get fouled, I think it's going to hurt the team more than it's going to help the team in the postseason and in this play-in matchup. And again, the Heat, they have a much better roster overall, and they have much more options. If Jimmy Butler is unable to score, they have Tyler Hero to score. If Bam Adebayo isn't able to score, they have Terry Rozier. They have all these other players. They have Gabe Vincent. They have all these players that just play better in the postseason, and they always sort of step up. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Heat end up winning this game and move on to play the Knicks in the first round, which is going to be a Eastern Conference semifinals matchup. But this time, the Knicks are going to be healthy, and they're actually going to have a lot more players to sort of help Jalen Brunson in the postseason. So I really think it's going to be a different story this time in the postseason, and we might see the Miami Heat make a deep run. We might not, but I don't really see that same thing happening for the Sixers. So my faith on the Sixers is relatively low. And regardless whether they win or they lose and they still make the playoffs, I genuinely do not think they have what it takes to make it past the first round. If they lose this matchup, if the Sixers lose this matchup and they have to go down to the 8th seed, I think that's it for them. I genuinely think that is the death sentence, and I think the Celtics are going to sweep them. Because the Celtics, they're just the better team compared to the Sixers, and the Celtics have a history of dominating the Sixers several years. For several years, they've had a history of beating the Sixers. And given how Joel Embiid plays in the postseason, I genuinely do not think that they'll have a chance to beat this high-powered Boston Celtics team, especially having Kristaps Porzingis at the 5, being a very tall center, 7'3", and being able to sort of disrupt Joel Embiid as he plays. So I think the Sixers' road ends here. I've said this previously, like their best bet is to just stay alive for the playoffs and pray to God that Joel Embiid gets better. But now that they're in the play-in, I genuinely do not think that they have a shot, because they go up against teams that are just much better than them as the 1 seed and the 2 seed. So I have the Heat winning this game, and the Sixers would have to play between either the Hawks or the Bulls. Now, this matchup is going to be a little bit closer than the previous matchup. So moving on to the Hawks versus the Bulls, they play at home, and they also play with relatively minimal play-in experience, I guess you could say. And they usually don't really have much success in the play-in. And the Hawks, however, they do have success in the play-in, with Trae Young playing relatively well and being able to lead his team to wins in these important games. So, but I don't see either of these teams making it out of the play-in. I genuinely think that both of these teams are done after this first game. Like, depending on who wins, they'll move on to play either the Sixers or the Heat, and I think that's it for them. So, not really much that needs to be, like, looking forward to on these two teams. I'm just looking for a good game, honestly. However, there is a wild card. And you guys are going to be a little bit surprised with this wild card, maybe not, but DeMar DeRozan's daughter. Now, if you guys remember from the last year's play-in tournament, DeAr DeRozan, I believe that's how you pronounce her name. Forgive me if I botched it, but she held, and I say she held because she held the Raptors to shooting like 58% from the free throw line or something like that. They shot really bad from the line as a team, and the reason being, at least the media gives it, the reason being, DeRozan's daughter. If you watch that game and you listen to that game, you can hear, every single time that the Raptors were at the line, she was screaming. She was straight screaming to the top of her lungs, and ultimately, they ended up missing a lot of those free throws. I don't know what it was, but they missed a lot more free throws than they usually do. And It was so bad that she even got death threats from these Raptors fans. Like, the fact that they're threatening a toddler because their team couldn't hit free throws is insane. And that was the biggest story of that play-in matchup. The fact that she was screaming so loud and the team was shooting free throws really bad, and that ultimately gave them the edge to win the game in the end. And so the fact that they play at home with DeRozan's daughter probably going to be in the front section is going to be interesting, because I guarantee you she is going to be screaming every single time that team is at the line. And it's probably going to be the biggest story of this play-in matchup. But the matchup itself, I think that the Hawks have a better chance of winning than the Miami Heat due to their experience in the postseason and due to how well Trae Young usually plays in front of the away crowd. Now, I'm speaking as someone who's relative to like the metropolitan area of New Jersey and New York. That man played in front of the Garden, in front of a hostile crowd, and completely shut them down. Like, he made all of New York quiet, and he made all of New York hate him, essentially. Like, there's not a single fan in New York that likes Trae Young whatsoever. And the fact that he can play in the Garden like that makes me think that, like, okay, if he can play in the Garden with all that hostility and still play well, he can play in front of any kind of home crowd in the postseason when it really matters and still play well. So I don't really think that being away is going to affect this Hawks team. However, only time will tell. And there's no really, like, guarantee. There's no real way to, like, know for sure that which team is going to win, especially with this matchups, because I genuinely do not know. And regardless, no matter which team makes it out, I think their playoff journey just ends right there, because the Heat and the Sixers, they have, like, this right now, the Heat, they have 10 more wins than the Hawks, and they have 7 more wins against 7 more wins against the Bulls. And the Sixers, they also have 10-plus games over the Hawks. They have 11 more wins than the Hawks do. And they also have 8 more wins than the Bulls do. So the gap between records in the Eastern Conference, between from the 7th and the 8th seed to the 9th and 10th seed, is much greater than the gap between the play-in teams in the Western Conference. So with that in mind, I don't think that either of those teams really have what it takes to make it past either of those teams. And this is where the play-in tournament sort of comes into question, because it makes sense to do it on the Western Conference. But on the Eastern Conference, when the game difference is literally 10, it doesn't really make that much sense, at least to me. Like, if I was Adam Silver and if I was the commissioner, I would honestly just disqualify both the Hawks and the Bulls from the play-in entirely and just focus on the Heat against the Sixers. Because the gap between those two teams in the 9th and 10th seed, they shouldn't even make the playoffs. They genuinely, if this was previous years before the play-in, there would be no debate on if they deserve to make the playoffs. There just wouldn't, because of the game difference. And I genuinely don't think that the play-in game between the Hawks and the Bulls really matters that much. So if I was the commissioner, I would have honestly just canceled this game and just the Heat and the Sixers play. And depending on who wins, holds the 7th seed, and whoever loses holds the 8th seed, because those two teams, they deserve to be in the playoffs far more than the Bulls and the Hawks. And I just don't think there's really a point in playing those games. Now, this could ultimately fall flat on my face if the Hawks or the Bulls end up beating either the Sixers or the Heat, depending on who loses, and that could obviously happen. That could because a one-game series, like anything can happen in a one-game series. But that's exactly why I don't think that the 9 and 10 seed in the Eastern Conference should be playing this time, because anything can happen, and they can ultimately just have 2 really good games in the play-in tournament, which thus propels them into the playoffs. And I don't really think that's fair to put either of those teams in the playoffs over the Sixers and the Heat, who have roughly 10 more wins, or like 8 more wins, than the Hawks and the Bulls. Because the reason why the play-in tournament was even established in the first place was because the seedings in the Western Conference, and arguably in the Eastern Conference at times, they're usually really, really close. Like, they're very close, and it's usually down to tiebreakers to who makes it to the playoffs. And the fact that it's really, really close, it's sort of unfair to the teams that have the same record, and it's like, give them a chance. Like, that's sort of what the play-in tournament, that's how I see the play-in tournament and why it was implemented into the NBA. But now that now that the game difference is by like 10, there's really no need to even have a play-in tournament for the Eastern Conference. But again, that would also just be unfair for to allow the West to play a play-in tournament, but not allow the East to play a play-in tournament. So they can't really do that, even though I genuinely think that they should. But these matchups, they're going to be highly anticipated, and specifically the first matchup, I'm just curious to see like who wins between the Bulls and the Hawks. It's just for curiosity. I genuinely do not think that they'll make it out of the into the playoffs, either of those teams, if they match up against either the Heat or the Sixers. I genuinely don't. But it's really to look forward to in the playoffs. It's really going to be which team is going to play the Boston Celtics in the first round. And if the Heat lose and they end up playing for the 8th seed and play against the Celtics, I'm not entirely sure who's going to win that series, because the Miami Heat, they lost to the Celtics before, then they beat them again. So I'm not entirely sure which team is going to win that matchup, because of how good the Heat are in the postseason and just like their tendency of being able to beat these really, really good teams. Because this wouldn't be the first time that they were an 8th seed and they beat the 1 seed. And this also wouldn't be the first time that the Celtics disappoint everyone in the postseason. So that series will be very, very competitive. That would be a really, really good first round. But if the Sixers play them, I genuinely think the Celtics can easily beat the Sixers. So if you're looking for a good first-round matchup, the Miami Heat against the Celtics would be really, really good. And so far, the only really good matchups in the Eastern Conference right now in the first round that are confirmed are the Bucks going up against the Pacers. And even then, now I don't think that's really going to be much of a series, because Giannis is supposedly going to be hurt for the remainder for some part of the postseason. And that's going to be something that the team, that is really going to be a struggle with the Bucks, the fact that they won't have Giannis for some of these games. And it's very, very concerning. But with that, we are out of time for the third segment. So now I will go ahead and go into the special fourth segment, where I reveal the NBA's punishment on Jonte Porter. Woj recently tweeted this out, so I'm just going to briefly talk about that after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.